Hey everybody, Mike Iaconelli back out here in the shop with yet another brand new video for you today. In today's shop, we're going to be talking about a technique that catches big bass, it catches a lot of bass, and in many situations, it's the only way to trigger a bite. In today's shop, we're going to be talking about the speed worm, the swim worm, the cut tail, the paddle tail, whatever you want to call it. I call them speed worms or swim worms. And we're going to be going over why this worm can make a difference. Before we get started, and before I show you some, let me take you back in time. In 2003, I fished the Bassmaster Classic on the Louisiana Delta. I fished in an area down in Venice called Delta Duck. And it was a giant weed flat. And it was an area where it was very, very hard to fish traditional lures like spinner baits or buzz baits or shallow crankbaits. You could fish them, but it was tough. And this lure, a speed worm, a swim worm, helped me win that tournament and helped me win the Classic. So I have a lot of fond memories of this bait. And to this day, in certain situations, the action of this bait helps me to catch fish when traditional lures won't work. Okay, let's go to what is a speed worm? What is a swim worm? A cut tail, a paddle tail. I'm going to show you a couple different types. In its purest form, a swim worm or a speed worm, a cut tail, is a plastic worm. When you look at the body of these baits, the upper body looks just like a worm, right? Not a whole lot of different between a regular plastic worm, okay? So, you know, thicker body, tapers down toward the tail, right? Every worm out there has that same construction and design. But when you get to the tail, that's where things change. And if you look at these baits, they have a paddle tail that's cut or like a little sort of a tab tail on the bottom. This one with the tab tail is pretty cool. This is a wind up by Berkeley Power Bait. And there's even some designs that just have a straight paddle tail. If you look at that paddle tail worm, that's a speed worm too. That's a swim worm as well. So if you look at that tail, right, instead of that big ribbon, or instead of that little straight tail, like a bottom hopper or a trick worm, it's got this paddle, like almost like a tennis racket looking paddle at the bottom. And that strange looking tail, there's that wind up again, that strange looking tail, that's the mechanism that's going to create this bite that we're going to talk about. That's the mechanism to really make these fish want to eat this bait. And that style tail, that paddle tail, cut tail style, produces a vibration unlike any other worm. And that's really the key, that movement of that tail, that vibration that's going to create these strikes. While I have these baits here, I do want to show you real quick a few modifications you can make to the tail before we rig them up, okay? So the first one is a regular paddle tail. And if these are the ones you own, the ones that have the traditional tennis racket style tail, there's a modification to make this bait better. And really all I do is I get the bait. This actually, believe it or not, is an old man's worm, just like the one that I used to win the Classic. And if you hold that paddle tail up, and it really now looks like a tennis racket, right? It looks like a tennis racket with the handle down. All I'm going to do is make a cut in that tail from the base toward the top of that racket, the top of that paddle, on an angle, right? On an angle, if you were looking at a clock, let's call it 11 o'clock. So I'm cutting from the base up to that tail, and I'm unlocking more action in that paddle tail. So I made the cut myself, okay? On these other brands, some of these other brands it's already cut. There's that wind up again. You don't need to cut it. It's already perfect. But even on these brands where it's already cut, there's one other modification that you can make to give it even more action. And basically the mod is to make a little hole, to make almost a 360-degree round hole at the very bottom or base of that cut. And you could do it with a hole punch. You could maybe sort of do it with a scissors. But the technique that I found that's the easiest is to use a metal straw. Everybody sells these at Walmart, Home Depot, home goods stores, anywhere, Target. It's a metal straw. I just keep it in my same box as all my swim worms, speed worms. And I'm going to lay this worm down, and I want to stick that metal straw and make a hole punch right where the end of that cut is. And so I place it in that cut. I just press down on a hard surface. And when you take it out, guys, look what we're left with. We created a little 360-degree hole right at the base of that cut. And that one little mod is going to give it even more vibration and action in the water. And that's key. All right, let's talk about rigging. Really simple, guys. When I'm fishing a speed worm or a swim worm style lure, I'm going to fish it Texas style. As I talk about my retrieves, I'm going to talk about a weightless and a weighted, but in either case, I'm going to use the good old Texas rig. These worms come in some different sizes, but in general, these worms are 5 to 6 inches long. That's that main size that I'm going to use are 5-inch worms, a little smaller, a little thinner. 6-inch worms, like the wind up, a little fatter, a little longer, but 5 and 6-inch worms. And because of that, here are my 2 favorite sizes of hooks. Because it's a worm, and look at it, even though it's got a worm body, that body's not very thick. It's just a regular rubber worm body. We're not going to use an extra wide gap, EWG. We're going to use a regular offset. And because they're 5 or 6 inches, I'm going to use a 3/0 offset worm hook for the 5-inch, and I'm going to use a 4/0 offset worm hook for the 6-inch. I use both the traditional gauge when they're smaller fish and less cover, and I'll use the heavy-duty gauge when they're bigger fish and thicker cover. But 3/0 for the 5-inch, 4/0 for the 6-inch. Again, regular offset worm hook. Nothing crazy there. And when you're using it weightless, that's it. We're just going to tie the hook on. But if we're using a worm weight, and when I get to my retrieves, you're going to see that's important, I like a smaller worm weight. Guys, I don't like to overpower this lure with a heavy weight. So I'm using a 1/16 of an ounce all the way up to a 1/4 of an ounce, depending on wind, depending on depth. But when I'm speed worming, when I'm swim worming, the 1/8 ounce bullet weight is the deal, okay? So 1/8 ounce bullet weight for the weighted techniques, and you're going to see this in the retrieves. And last but not least, I put a bobber stop on when I'm using that weight, and that helps keep the weight at the nose of the bait. All right, let's rig one of these up, guys. You know what a Texas rig is. I'll do it again for you. What'd I do with that 5-inch? I threw it somewhere. It's great. I don't see it, so we'll just use the 5-inch. 6-inch. So traditional Texas rig, I'm going to rig it. I'm going to go in about a little more than 1/8 of an inch in the nose of the bait. I'm going to push it out. I'm going to bring it all the way around the shank of the hook. And then I'm going to do my normal Texas rig. And I just really, when I bury that hook in, I want to push it through a couple times. I want to sort of work a channel there. And I just make sure that it's exposed. So it's just barely covered. One thing I want you to do is I always want you to have that cut tail facing down. Or, better way to put it, that cut tail should be the opposite direction of the bend of the hook. Because when you do that, you're going to maximize that vibration and action. And that's what this worm is all about, okay? So nice and straight, tail facing the opposite way, the bend of the hook. And on the weighted models, we're going to snug it down and we're ready to go. All right, there's your rigging, simple Texas rigging, no big deal. Now let me tell you about the 3 ways we're going to fish it. And then real quick, we'll go over the rod, reel, and line. Line's real critical. And there's your speed worming, okay? So let's talk about the 3 retrieves. The first one is a speed worm that I'm going to use without the weight. Without the weight. And I love to fish it like this for a subsurface to surface presentation. Let's think about those scenarios. Guys, when fish are shallow, when fish are feeding up and they're busting up, this is a great alternative to other topwaters. You heard me mention it before. To me, a swim worm or a speed worm, there's that wind up by Berkeley, really can do something different and more subtle to trigger the fish. So if you're fishing a shallow grass flat, eelgrass, lily pads, submergent grass like bulrush or reeds or peppergrass or anything, you see a lot of guys throwing a buzz bait. You see a lot of guys throwing a popper, a walking bait, a prop bait. Those baits have limitations because of the nature of the bait. Treble hooks, blades, metal. But when you look at that Texas rigged speed worm, swim worm, cut tail with no weight, dude, it's totally weedless, totally snagless. But the magic, I'm going to say it again, is in that tail. So when I fish it without a weight, I'm making a long cast, usually for surface feeding fish, shallow water, vegetation, brush, cover around, and I'm holding my rod up and I'm actually buzzing it on the surface or just below it, making a wake. And that tail throws off a vibration and movement. And that's the trigger to those fish. So I'm reeling it on the surface, and it almost sounds like a really small buzz bait. Like just a little spit, a little gurgle, and a little left to right vibration. And you could actually feel it through your rod tip. It actually kind of gives a little pulse. And besides it being way more weedless than most of those other topwaters, that subtle tail movement, spit, vibration is the trigger. And it makes a lot of sense, right, guys? Everybody's throwing big, noisy buzz baits and whopper ploppers, and all of a sudden this thing comes by. Very subtle. And it gets a lot of bites when those other lures stop working or won't work, okay? So presentation number 1, long cast, rod up, buzzing it on the top or subsurface. Great technique for shallow water, especially grass flats. All right, technique number 2. And this one we're going to use the weight, guys. And this is the way that I use this style worm the most. This paddle tail, cut tail, speed worm, cut, whatever you want to call it. This is the method that I use the most. And it's just a medium, mid water column retrieve. So for this retrieve, I'm using the weight, but remember, I'm trying to get away with the smallest weight I can to keep it down in about the middle of the water column. I love that 16th. I love the 3/16 if the wind's blowing a little more, the 16th if it's dead calm, the 3/16 if there's wind. But my number 1 weight size, mark this down, guys, my number 1 weight size for this swim worm, speed worm, is a 1/8 ounce tungsten weight, VMC tungsten worm weight. I put that weight on, my bobber stop's on there, I slide the bobber stop down. Now I got a bait that I'm going to fish subsurface. Just like I gave you the analogy with the topwater baits, right? Guys throwing a topwater that's a buzz bait, a prop bait, a whopper plopper, noisy, treble hooks, obtrusive. The analogy for this one, swim worm fished in the middle of the water column, it's a subtle chatterbait. It's a subtle spinnerbait. It's a more subtle diving crankbait, right? Think about the vibration of a chatterbait. It's got a fixed blade. It's got a hinged blade. You throw it out there. Dude, that bait's a big blade at spinnerbait. Big Colorado blade at spinnerbait. You throw it out there. Very heavy vibration, noisy, wires, blades, metal, rattles. The swim worm, the speed worm, comes through that same water column with a subtle tail vibration, a subtle action. No metal, no rattles, no noise. Subtly comes through, and you could feel it through your rod tip, just a little. It's a little vibration. That is so key, guys, so key. And on this retrieve, through the middle of the water column, I'm literally going to fish it exactly like you would a spinnerbait or a chatterbait or a square bill. Exactly. I'm going to throw it out there. I'm going to let it get down to about the middle of the water column with my rod tip now, instead of being high up, lowered. I'm at about 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, a medium retrieve. Every once in a while, 10, 15 cranks, I'll pause and pick it back up. And when I retrieve that bait, that cut tail, right? That wind-up tail, that paddle tail that you modified, subtle vibration. Pressured fish, fish that have seen all chatterbaits for a month, feel this thing and see the subtle silhouette and profile, and they want to eat it. Some of my favorite scenarios to fish it in the middle of the water column would be just the kind of places you'd fish a square bill or a spinnerbait or a chatterbait. Alongside docks, around deeper grass, deeper submergent grass, eelgrass, milfoil, hydrilla, that has a window of water above it, ticking the top of the grass. Standing timber, riprap, where everybody else has gone down a riprap dam or a riprap causeway, throwing a spinnerbait and a chatterbait. Now you come by with this. Makes a big difference. Especially the more pressured the fish, the tougher the fishing, the more I opt for a swim worm or a speed worm over a chatterbait or a spinnerbait or a square bill. Okay, so retrieve number 2 in the middle of the water column, just winding it, pause every once in a while. If you're fishing around cover and you could purposely make this thing bang into the cover, do it, right? So if you're fishing around docks, throw it by the dock, purposely hit it into the dock post, pause it, and retrieve again. A lot of times that little deflection off the eelgrass or the milfoil or a rock on riprap, right? Hit off a rock and just keep it coming. That'll trigger the bite. All right. Last retrieve style that I use for these worms, guys, swim worms, speed worms, cuttail, paddle, whatever you want to call it, is the slow roll technique. The slow roll technique. Once again, a good analogy for this might be a big spinnerbait, like a 3/4 ounce spinnerbait, slow rolled on the bottom, a big chatterbait, a medium or deep diving crankbait, right? So many people, anglers, when you get in that 8, 10, 12, 15, even 20 feet, deep water, big crankbait, right? Big plug, just big bill, rattling, noisy, a DT20, a DT16, down there creating ruckus. I'm going to fish that in the same scenario, toward the bottom, deeper water, getting a bite that I couldn't get with those other lures because of that tail and the subtle nature of this lure, okay? The only difference now, listen to me, when I get deeper, I'm just going to go up in weight size. So instead of that 16th or 8th ounce that I used for that mid-water column, now I'm going to go to the 3/16 if I'm in 8 to 12, if there's no wind, and I'm going to go to that 1/4 ounce worm weight, especially if there's a little wind and I want to get it deeper. So 15 feet, 18 feet, 20 feet, 1/4 ounce worm weight. And again, I'm just snugging it down with that bobber stop. And this one is going to be even different yet than those other 2 retrieves. And this one is exactly like slow rolling any of those other baits. This one's exactly like a deep diving crankbait. I'm going to make that long cast past where the fish are, past the target. But this time I'm going to let it sink all the way to the bottom, right? So as it's sinking, I'm feeding it line. I'm leaning to it. I want to let that bait hit the bottom. Once that bait hits the bottom, I'm going to get my rod. I'm going to really keep it low. 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock. I'm going to keep it low, and I'm going to barely move that reel handle. Guys, listen. When you're slow rolling this speed worm, this swim worm, this cut tail, just ease along the bottom. Best way I can describe it. My rod's low. I'm just barely, honestly, this is the retrieve I'm doing. Ready? Barely reeling it, and about every 8 or 10 cranks, you ready? I pause. I let it settle back down. I want to feel it hit the bottom, and I just barely reel again. And that allows this bait to get down to the bottom, even in deeper water, and keep in contact with the bottom. So it's doing exactly what a deep diving crankbait would do. It's doing exactly what a heavy spinner bait would do, a heavy chatterbait. But there's that tail. Guys, there's that paddle tail, that cut tail, modified with that little hole. And it just has that little side-to-side action. Just a little bit of vibration. Everybody else, big, noisy, loud, obtrusive. Now you're raking the bottom in those same areas with a cut tail. Subtle, less obtrusive. Really an amazing presentation. Just like the mid-depth version, it's great around grass, deep grass. It's great around ledges, main lake points, sunken brush piles. Everybody else is throwing a big giant jig. You come through with this, tick the brush, watch what happens, okay? So go out of your way to hit the cover, let it get to the bottom, slowly retrieve it. Don't overpower it. Let that tail do the work for you. So the third way, the slow roll technique. Guys, listen to me. If you haven't already tried a speed worm, if you already haven't tried a cut tail or paddle tail style worm, give this technique a try. In certain situations, it will catch fish when nothing else will. I hope you enjoyed this shop talking about speed worms. If you do, stop right now, hit my subscribe button, subscribe to the channel. If you do that, we're going to send you a notification every single time a new video launches. And guess what? That's at least one a week. If you're already subscribed to the channel, tell your friends about Mike Iaconelli Fishing on YouTube. We're here to help you hopefully become a better angler. Give these speed worms, swim worms, cut tails a try, and you're going to catch more fish. Bye. Hey everybody, Mike Iaconelli. I hope you enjoyed this week's In the Shop. I hope you learned a little bit. And if you like these videos, remember, there's a whole boatload. Check out these two, and you're going to learn more about bass fishing.